What's up, photographers? In this video I'll be talking about a quick and easy little technique called foreshortening to make your images pop and stand out from the rest of the crowd. In fact, this technique itself is often used by many popular photographers to capture images that really stand out and that get a lot of likes and attention online. This technique was even used by Michelangelo himself, which is pretty cool. So with that being said, in this video I'll be covering what foreshortening is, how to use it, and lots more. So let's dive in.
Foreshortening in photography is a perspective technique to make an object or subject appear closer with less depth. The goal of foreshortening in photography is to create an image that appears to be coming towards the viewer, making it more engaging and visually interesting. For example, in this image I took, I have the subject extending their hand, and their hand is what's foreshortened. Outside of photography, to foreshorten means to portray or show an object as closer than it is. So essentially, we just take this definition and apply it to the photography realm. It's also important to note that foreshortening actually comes from the art world in general, where it refers to the technique of depicting an object or figure as closer than it actually is by shortening its length in the drawing or painting. This technique can be found in many forms of art outside of photography, such as painting, drawing, sculpture, and even film. In fact, Michelangelo was a great practitioner of foreshortening. Foreshortening in photography is caused by the distortion of perspective that occurs when the subject or object is viewed at an angle rather than straight on. This perspective is distorted due to the way our eyes perceive depth and distance. When we view an object straight on, the object appears to have true proportions and dimensions. When we view an object at an angle, however, the dimensions appear to change. The parts of the object closest to the lens will appear larger, while the parts of the object furthest away from the lens will appear smaller. For example, have you ever seen those classic photos of people posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, where they appear to be putting their finger on top of the Eiffel Tower? That's an example of foreshortening. Foreshortening in photography is influenced by four main factors. The first factor that can create a foreshortened image has to do with the photographer's camera angle. When the camera is tilted or angled a certain way, the subject's proportions in the X and Y axis change. This can create that illusion of foreshortening. For example, tilting the camera downwards while photographing a person can make their head appear larger than their body, and vice versa if you tilt the camera upwards. The second factor that can create a foreshortened image is by adjusting the focal length. When the focal length of the lens is adjusted, the photographer can change the size of the subject in the frame. A longer focal length lens can make the subject appear larger in the frame, while a shorter focal length lens can make the subject appear smaller. When the longer focal length lens is used on a subject at an angle, the parts of the subject closest to the camera lens will appear larger in the X and Y axes, creating that illusion of foreshortening. The third factor that could create a foreshortened image is by manipulating your subject's position in the frame. For example, you could ask the subject to lean towards the camera to make their head appear larger in the frame than their body. Another example, and a more creative one, is to have your subject reach out with their hands towards the camera lens to make a 3D look effect and as if they're reaching out to the viewer. Combine the different types of lenses along with a change in camera angle and manipulate your subject's position, and you'll be able to create different types of foreshortening effects. We've discussed what foreshortening is in photography and what causes it, but why would a photographer want to employ this technique? If your objective as a photographer is to create a sense of depth, then foreshortening is a technique you may want to consider. Foreshortening is a great way to add depth to an image and to make it more visually interesting and dynamic. Foreshortening can also be used to add emphasis to your photo by highlighting and drawing attention to certain parts of the subject, or to create a sense of action. For example, a foreshortened image of a runner against a track background can create the impression of speed and motion. This is often popularized in movies and TV shows, and for example, with the Flash superhero character. If your goal as a photographer is to add some drama to your image, then foreshortening can accomplish this by exaggerating the proportions of the subject. If done correctly, it could create a more intense and emotional impact on the viewer. Photographers love experimenting with new techniques and ways to improve. Foreshortening is a great technique to experiment with because it can be a bit challenging in terms of which parts of the body to foreshorten without looking clownish, and it can also be rewarding when you get it down. Overall, by incorporating foreshortening into your work as a photographer, you can add variety and interest to your portfolio and push the boundaries of your artistic expression while also adding a new tool to your photography tool belt. Now let's dive into how to capture foreshortening in your photography based on different photography niches. In portrait photography, foreshortening is a great technique you can use when you want to add depth, drama, and emotion to your portraits. The main things I look at when I want to take a portrait that uses foreshortening are the parts of the body I want to be foreshortened, the angle I'm in, and the lens I'm using. When it comes to the parts of the body that can be foreshortened, they are often the hands or arms, and the legs and the feet. Common poses to use include having the subject reach out their hand towards the lens, which will foreshorten their hand and arm, and also having the subject reach out their foot towards the lens, which will foreshorten their foot and their leg. The common angles to use when using foreshortening is to either shoot low while tilting the camera up, which is great to use when trying to foreshorten their foot and leg, or to shoot straight on or tilting slightly downwards if trying to foreshorten their hand and arm. The biggest thing to remember when foreshortening with portrait photography is to avoid any unflattering instances of foreshortening, such as where it looks like one leg is shorter than another, or if it looks like their arm is in their body. Ways to avoid this include making sure everything is bent and at an angle. This way you avoid instances that make the subject look unflattering. You can implement foreshortening in landscape photography by changing viewpoints, looking for lines and shapes, and experimenting with framing. Examples of foreshortening in landscape photography include images that use wide-angle lenses to exaggerate the perspective, such as the shot of a road receding into the distance, or images that use a strong foreground element to create a sense of depth, such as a tree or rock formation in the foreground of the image. Other examples could include images that use leading lines or shapes within the landscape to create a sense of foreshortening, such as a winding river or a mountain range that appears to stretch off into the distance. By using these techniques, photographers can create dynamic and visually interesting images that capture the beauty of the natural world. Foreshortening in product photography is great to add depth and dimension to your images, making the product appear more dynamic and visually interesting. This is great for e-commerce companies when you really want your product to stand out amongst the rest of the crowd. Ways you can implement foreshortening in product photography is by changing the angle of your camera, experimenting with lighting, and playing around with different types of composition. Examples of foreshortening in product photography include images that use a low angle to make the product appear larger and more prominent, such as a close-up shot of a watch or jewelry. Other examples could include images that use a wide-angle lens to create a sense of depth and dimensionality, such as a shot of a camera or electronic device on a table with a strong foreground element. By using these techniques, you can create a dynamic and visually interesting product image that stands out and captures the attention of potential customers. While foreshortening is a great technique for creating dynamic and visually interesting images, there are some situations you'll want to avoid using it. Foreshortening often requires a wider field of view, which may be difficult to achieve in a tight or limited space. In these situations, it may be better to use other techniques to capture the shot. Foreshortening can be challenging when photographing certain subjects, such as animals or objects with irregular shapes. In these cases, other techniques such as perspective or symmetry may be more effective. Foreshortening can create dramatic and visually interesting images, but it may not always be appropriate for the specific purpose or audience of the photo. For example, a corporate headshot or brand photography session may require a more straightforward and traditional approach. Foreshortening can create a distorted perspective, which may not be ideal when shooting for documentation purposes. In these cases, a more objective and accurate approach may be necessary. In conclusion, foreshortening is a great technique to have under your photography toolbelt. If you haven't tried this technique before, I recommend you go out and try it to see if you like it. Good luck, and thanks for watching.